Hi everyone. So I'm Ashley and I'm from Schroders, and you have joined our second session of the Potential Over Polish speaker series. Today I have some really exciting panelists here, and from our briefing call, I am really interested to see how this discussion goes. So we have Dr. Louise Ashley, and just from the title of her book that's just come out, that is Highly Discriminating Why the City Isn't Fair and Diversity Doesn't Work. And she's up on a panel with, I was going to say against, but not really against. We do agree on some things. So we're all on a panel joined by Stephanie Lieber, who is the acting CEO of Upreach, and Karis Stander, who is the managing director of Investment 2020. Now, in the last session, if you joined, it was a discussion between me and Matthew Syed, and it was slightly broader in that it looked at diversity of thought and how this is relevant to socio-economic diversity and social mobility, but then also how the non-visible diversity characteristics are often neglected. And in this session, we want to delve a little bit deeper into really the sort of initiatives that exist and the challenges that exist around socio-economic diversity and social mobility within financial services and sectors like this. So a quick welcome to everybody on the panel. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ash.
We've got a wave.
Yeah.
Thanks. And I think we should have quite an interesting discussion here with a mix of one of you being from the more sort of academic side of it and the other two coming from a more practical standpoint. So where possible, I'd encourage everyone to answer every question and sort of chip in if you've got any other views that either agree with or conflict or contrast with points that have been made. And everyone that's joined us live, I would encourage you to ask questions throughout. You can send them into the chat and we'll all be able to see those. So if they're relevant to something we're talking about, we will try and pull them in. And at the end, I'll allow a little bit of time so that we can sort of quickly get through as many of those as we can. So first question, I think relevant to all of you is, what is the sort of challenges that you see with social mobility, and so how does that differ from the UK versus other countries, or do you see this as something that's just a global problem?
Shall I come in on that one, Ashley? Or
yeah, just feel free to chip in.
Okay, okay, great. Okay, so challenges around social mobility and whether this is a global problem. So it's not the same in every country in the world, but it is one that does afflict many countries at the moment. In the UK, would it be just helpful if I gave a brief overview of kind of trends in social mobility and what that's looked like over the last kind of 10, 20, 30 years? So basically, if we think about why this is important, first of all, for politicians and policymakers, social mobility is often really important because it's indicative of a kind of fluid and therefore meritocratic society. So one which has high levels of social mobility is also one where the right people are allocated to the right jobs on the basis of what we call achieved characteristics. So things like aptitude, talent, skill, education, whatever else it might be, rather than what we call ascribed characteristics such as family background or even say ethnicity or gender, for example. So that's really valued when we can achieve that sort of society because it suggests that the allocation of opportunities is fair. And that fits with sort of liberal notions of equal opportunity broadly, less so with notions of equal outcome. We might come on to that later in our conversation. So there's a really important kind of commitment to social mobility as something that's good for societies and indicative of a fair society. In terms of trends, very briefly, this is contested, but in the UK, what we tend to agree on is that we had a kind of golden period of absolute social mobility in the post-war period. And that was when there was an absolute expansion of professional and managerial jobs, which facilitate upward social mobility journeys. Now, the broad consensus is that period came to an end around the kind of 80s. But we would also argue that relative social mobility, so our chances of moving into a higher position relative to our parents, has stayed pretty much the same throughout that period and has always been quite low in the UK. Now, one point then, I'll stop soon, I promise, is that politicians often particularly frame this as a decline across the board. That's not quite true. One other complexity is that in the UK, we have quite good fluidity towards the middle of society, but our main problems is what we call a very sticky floor. So if you're born in a less advantaged position, it's quite difficult to move. And then we have very tight closure at the top of societies. So kind of the top jobs, if you like, are confined to a fairly narrow elite, and they have been for some time. And I think that kind of latter issue is particularly what we'll be thinking about today. Very briefly, in terms of comparisons with other countries, I guess the most important thing to know here is that social mobility is inversely correlated with inequality. So it's least likely in the most unequal countries. And that's really significant because the UK is a highly unequal country and we have quite low levels of relative social mobility. We tend to find that in more equal societies, social mobility is more likely. But we're similar, for example, to the States, which also is highly unequal and has low rates of social mobility, despite having a very strong narrative of merit. I'll stop there. That's a bit of a monologue.
That's really, really great point to make. Thank you. And what about the other two?
I guess the only thing that I would add in that is there's been a real focus over the last 10 years on access to university, and that has been viewed as maybe a panacea to social mobility. But what we find, and the reason why we're focused on working with students that are at university trying to achieve their first graduate job, is because that has not closed the employability skills gap. It might have closed the academic gap, and they are able to perform at a higher level once they're at university, students from kind of a less advantaged background, but it hasn't necessarily closed that employability skills gap, which is obviously one of the characteristics or factors that employers are looking at whenever they are looking to make hiring decisions. So that is why we've put a focus kind of at the university level. Obviously that gap, that employability skills gap really starts at a very, very young age. And that differentiation becomes a wider and wider gap as you kind of progress through your education. If you're not receiving the support, both from charities like the two that are represented here today, or actually from organizations making differences in the way they recruit or the way they look at candidates. So it is a double benefit approach that we take. And it's really trying to focus on not just one aspect of the progression, not just getting into university, but also getting into those elite jobs or those top jobs, as Louise was talking about.
Very eloquently put by Louise and Stephanie, and obviously with the academic overlay to that. And if I can just one point I'd add to this when we talk about why is social mobility such a problem within the UK today. And I do think that, when I apply this within a business perspective, and how do we make sure that we have the access and we have the progression sitting within businesses, part of the issue is that access is inhibited. It is very difficult to be able to access. And of course, that's not job done when you do get access. It's about progression. And when you have senior leaders who are not necessarily identifying and understanding where the problem is, just having a heart and wanting to make change is one thing. And that's obviously really, really important. But do we as a society and as businesses and as senior leaders actually understand what those pernicious barriers are? And if we don't understand those barriers, it makes it really, really difficult to be able to then start to unpick and make the changes that count.
There's already so much in your answers that I want to unpick and sort of ask you more on, but I do definitely want to turn our attention later to the idea of progression rather than just entry. But actually, I think at least two of you there discussed mentioned the sense that things have changed over time. So Would you say that the conversation around social mobility has changed, and the sort of policy or incentives or regulation around this, how have you seen this shift over time?
Shall I go against jumping in ahead of other people? Yeah, so it definitely has changed. So again, I'll try and be as brief as possible. But if we think about kind of social class generally and how that relates to kind of equality and diversity, during the kind of 80s and 90s, it wasn't a topic of conversation a lot of the time. It sort of fell off the policy agenda, if you like, and it really definitely wasn't on kind of organisational agendas in terms of diversity and inclusion. And that was to do with changes in society around that time. So political leaders kind of moving the focus away from social class, the idea that individuals become more important. Tony Blair's government put a very strong emphasis on education, and the notion was that this very strong emphasis on education would iron out social class differences, would actually contribute towards this more meritocratic and socially mobile country. And around the kind of late 2000s, it became increasingly evident that that hadn't happened for a variety of reasons. And at that point, there was a whole kind of bunch of policy interventions, which meant that social mobility came back on the agenda and social class came back on the agenda. So things like the Cabinet Office Panel for Fair Access to the Professions, that's a mouthful, came out in 2010, otherwise known as the Milburn Review. And that really highlighted that access to elite occupations for people from less privileged backgrounds had become more difficult over the last kind of 30 years rather than easier. And that really sparked a whole range. I mean, there was already activity going on around this, but it kind of accelerated, I'd say, at that point. And we started to see social class gradually join the agenda in organisations as part of their diversity policies. That's still quite patchy, but we're seeing much more of that now than we used to. I would just say, maybe it's okay to highlight this at this point, that social mobility is really important and these activities are really important and we should absolutely work to facilitate it. For more critical academics, I suppose I'd put myself in that area, we also do point out that social mobility is not in itself a solution to inequalities. It doesn't eradicate or reduce inequalities of income and wealth. And one problem that we argue sometimes is that it actually works to legitimate them. So if you can convince people that your society is fair, then you can also legitimate and justify very significant inequalities of income and wealth. And that's really relevant for a number of reasons, but going back to my previous point, which is that inequality and social mobility are in fact related. So you don't really get social mobility without reducing inequality. Therefore, we do need to look at this holistically, I think.
Yeah, that's great. And then I would sort of throw that question to Caris and Stephanie as well. Have you seen the conversation change over time, or any of the sort of initiatives that you've been seeing that you would say 5-10 years ago just wouldn't have existed, wouldn't have been considered?
Well, there's been a huge shift. We've certainly seen this when I look, obviously my focus is looking at investment management, but we've seen a massive shift. So I think back to, when Investment 2020 was started, and while it was started 8 years ago, not specifically looking at social mobility, but looking at diversity in the round and providing accessible access into the industry, comments were made by senior leaders saying, that's such a noble thing to do. It's a wonderful thing to do. And we're proud to be part of it. Whereas now that shift has turned into looking at as business critical. And of course, a huge component of that is socioeconomic access. And there's so many different levers as to why businesses are looking at this, but also we're seeing a big a big desire coming from within one's own staff. So actually, staff are asking, what are we doing as a business? What are we doing as an industry to be able to have access? We're also seeing a lot more discussion happening where people are being a lot more open about their own backgrounds. And so, I know, Ash, you spoke at a previous one, you were talking about how you have morphed in how you speak, for example, to fit within. And a lot of us did this from many different backgrounds. And it's become more acceptable for people to actually share what their background actually is and not to try and look like everyone else, and to normalize that. So I think that there's been a big push internally from staff, but also from wider stakeholders who are now assessing firms in a different kind of way, and that they live up to their values. And that also includes how accessible they are in terms of access and also progression.
Yeah, I'll just kind of add on to that. Completely agree with what Karis is saying. We started as an organization about 10 years ago, and the reason why we started as an organization is because the focus was on getting into university, and there wasn't really that focus on progression to the graduate job. Now the universities and the Office for Students is very focused. It's not good enough to just get into university. You need to be successful at university and then progress to the graduate job. So there's definitely a shift in focus from that perspective. And then working with a lot of our partners, our employer partners, we are definitely seeing exponential growth and interest in kind of the socioeconomic access to graduate jobs. There are quite a few charities out there who have been focused on other diversity characteristics and have started to expand into kind of the socioeconomic space as well, because that is such an interest of trying to identify that access point. I think where there still needs to be more work, and based on kind of our relationship with our alum who have graduated from the UpReach program, is yes, there is a lot of activity on that progression into a graduate job and lots of focus on that. But then as you talked about, Ashley, we're going to talk a little bit more about progression within, and we're starting to see more of our partners start to focus on that aspect of it, because inclusion is not just about getting in, it's obviously the inclusion once you are there. But completely agree with Karis from some of the perspectives of the expansion of the networks. We've seen a lot more social mobility networks being established at some of the partner employers that we have.
And I guess, so for two of you in particular here, you're working to increase the number of people who get into these industries. And I know there's the progression part as well, but for now, just the entry point. Is there a risk that we're sort of shoehorning people in and that nothing's happening within the culture, and these people still stand out as being the anomalies, and it's all to do with giving yourself a great pat on the back and saying, we're doing our part, look at that person there, they fit that mold that is the sort of inclusion with getting people from all sorts of backgrounds? Is there a risk that we're doing too much at that level and we're not doing enough to encourage cultural change within businesses?
Sorry, Stephanie, I think, well, I certainly hope that it is not about saying, look at us and what we're doing, but sometimes the temptation of being self-congratulatory can be there. But I agree with you, the cultural shift is a key element, because if we look at making an effective entry-level program, obviously you've got the supply, you've got the outreach, the student engagement, and reaching deep into communities of people who hadn't even considered an industry simply because they haven't heard of it. They don't have mums and dads in it, and personal networks. And that's really, really important. And of course, signposting to accessible entry-level jobs. But that isn't job done in itself, addressing the supply. Of course, we need to look at the cultural aspects that sit when it comes to recruitment, and when it comes to looking at job descriptions, and what does good look like? What does a good outcome look like? And we're all creatures of habit. We all go back to our customs and habits and how we do things. And the same applies to how we recruit. And I would say that making the cultural shift is perhaps the most difficult one. And it does, everybody gets, if I want a different outcome, I've got to change a behavior. We all get that. It makes logical sense. But when it comes to actually doing it, it becomes really quite challenging for people. And they feel inherently, as hiring managers, really, really uncomfortable doing that, because it means using a completely different approach and being told to do things such as, hiring for potential over and above polish. And while that sounds good, it can actually, what's sitting behind it can actually be just a little bit ethereal. And what does it actually mean? And can you give me a set criteria as to what I need to assess against? and how do I go about doing that, which you can't always do. So that it is the shock of the new that makes people feel somewhat uncomfortable. And of course, there is the other side to it, which is about the practicalities of recruiting somebody who doesn't work out. And when you don't have a guarantee that it is going to be a good hire, because we never know that, do we? But somehow we think by just going back to your old habits, oh, well, it will be fine, because we know at the end it generally does. Then there's the concern of what does it mean within the team? What does it mean if the person doesn't work out, and the headache that comes with that? So I think there is a bit of risk aversion over here, and thinking that there is going to be a risk. But the cultural side is absolutely the most important piece, because it is through genuinely having hiring managers and teams that buy into an inclusive recruitment practice and really challenge the norms of what they have, and ask themselves, the fact that I did that, what is the outcome, and did it work? And can we try something different? That ultimately drives a different behavior.
So as I mentioned earlier, we take a double benefit approach. And just like Karis was talking about, there's definitely the supply side that we focus on, working with the students, helping, coach them and prepare them for application processes, access to lots of top graduate roles by working with our partners to create events. But the supply side is only half of it. As Karis was talking about, there's also the demand side, and that's the double benefit approach that we try to take, working with our partners to actually change the system, make recommendations on how they might expand the system so that they're actually finding that potential in there. It can be anything from contextual recruitment, taking into consideration the background of that individual through that evaluation process. It could mean just a simple thing like considering the life experience of an individual. One of the things that we really focus on at UpReach is working with the students to be able to describe their life experience and how their life story actually realizes value in the organization, creates transferable skills, et cetera. But what we need employers to appreciate is the fact that life experience might generate those transferable skills that they're looking for, as opposed to a work experience program. So it is just an element of education and working with the employers to help them understand what the potential is based on that life experience and that background. So it's definitely both sides of it, supply and demand, that we need to think about as an organization and as a society and an employer. It's not just preparing the students to get in, but it's also changing the system so that there is acknowledgement of the skill set that those individuals bring.
And then Louise, I know you've probably got quite a few views on this, but also I've read, I can't remember where it was that I read it, but actually you talk a lot about how there's a business case that obviously says inclusion and diversity is fantastic. We should do more of it. Everyone that's joined this probably is already on board with that idea. But there's also a side of it where, especially sort of the elite sort of industries and financial services, and where exclusivity has been something that has been important to these industries for a while. So I wonder if you could explain that a little bit more and talk us through your thought process there.
Yes, I'll do my best. So prepare yourself for a bit of sociological theory, everybody. But I'm always telling my students that theory is practical. So I'll try and prove that today. Gosh, where do I start? Okay, so as in my research and as a sociologist, I tend to look at the mechanisms of exclusion. So I look at the how of exclusion, but I also look at the why. So that's really important, because I look at what the function of exclusion is, because unless we understand what the purpose of exclusion is, we can't understand my other main theme, which is why diversity doesn't always work as well as we might hope. Okay, so what I argue is, yes, of course, there is a business case for change, and there is a business case for inclusivity. And it's all the things that we're familiar with around kind of performance and talent and interacting with clients and creativity, all those kind of things probably do exist. However, One problem with the business case is it works on a faulty economic logic. So it basically suggests that hiring managers are efficiency maximizers who, once they realize the benefits of inclusion and diversity, will feel compelled to act, because that would be the rational thing to do. And that's actually central to the whole meritocratic narrative as well. The trouble with it is, if that were true, if hiring managers were efficiency maximizers who always worked according to economic efficiency, then the problem wouldn't really exist. So the business case is not as effective as we might like, because, well, partly because it rests on a fairly faulty economic logic. In reality, hiring managers, people who are in charge of promotion, tend to use customs, tradition, habit, internalized norms, all sorts of other things related to culture which inform their decisions that may or may not relate to economic efficiency. And that's sort of what we have to get to. So that's one issue. But going back to the kind of question that you asked me, what we also know in thinking about the function of exclusion is when we think of the sort of elite professional and managerial jobs that we're talking about today, so-called top jobs, we know that historically exclusion has offered or provided benefits to those organizations. And it's quite complicated and long-winded to explain this. But for example, if you can present an image of exclusivity, one thing you can do is affect impressions of supply and demand. So you can create or construct an artificial scarcity or artificial illusion of scarcity, which makes it look like the skills that you offer are in relatively short supply. There's real benefits of doing that, because then that makes the skills that you supply more valuable to the market. We call that in sociology the professional project. It's sort of a status project. In more kind of prosaic terms, I would say that the so-called war for talent is part of that. So I would say that organizations, elite organizations, have defined talent in very narrow terms. They fought with each other to recruit from that very small pool, and they call that a war for talent. It's not really a war for talent, it's a phony war for talent, because it's based on this incredibly narrow definition of what talent actually is. So that's one way. Another way is that, and I'll be as quick as I can with this, but essentially, when we think what gives organizations an occupation status, and therefore which gives them high value, which means they can charge very high fees and pay their people lots of money, we tend, or common sense would suggest, that that status is derived from the complexity of the work. So more complex work requires more complex skills, maybe higher education levels, and therefore those people are of very high value, and those things give their status to the work. And that again fits very closely with the meritocratic narrative with which we're all familiar. But again, what we know from decades of research really is that's not the only way that occupations generate status. Another way is to attach their status to the status of people we typically associate with the work. What I mean by that is that occupations or job types most associated with people with high status social identities tend also to have the highest status. Now, in our society, historically, the people with the highest status social identities have been, and just to generalize here, white middle class men. So what we tend to find is that occupations associated with white middle class men tend to have the highest status. When they diversify significantly, they tend to lose that status, and they often have lower fees and lower pay. And we do see that quite repeatedly, and there's lots of examples of it. Now, if we take that argument on board, we can also understand that diversification may well have business benefits, but it also comes with perceived risks. And that is one reason why it's resisted and why we see progress being relatively slow. I hope that wasn't too long-winded. I tried to get through that as quickly as possible.
No, you did very well.
I could go on, but I won't.
You covered a lot. And I guess, so where we're talking about the sticky floor, we've got this level of senior leaders who are stuck. They have set views. They might voice that they want to change things. When they recruit, do they actually want to change anything? How do we start shifting the mentality of recruitment, but also how do we start sort of transitioning the senior leadership so that it reflects a more diverse socioeconomic background? And that's something that I'm sure you've all got something to say on. So whoever gets there first.
I'll just add one point, if that's okay. Sorry, going ahead of you, Stephanie and Karis, but very briefly, one thing that I would just mention, which is related to this, is that we've talked a lot about kind of cultures and behaviours here, and I do think that's really important. But again, if we look at kind of the academic evidence around what works on diversity, it would tend to underline that we need to change structures and systems first and foremost, because structures and systems change, culture follows. It's incredibly difficult to change cultures without changing structures and systems. And the fact that we focus on culture and on behaviours, and that's a very characteristic element of the diversity agenda, is also one of the main criticisms of the agenda for sociologists like me. It's one of the reasons it doesn't work, essentially. And what the argument would be is that we need to do, to have meaningful change which leads to inclusive cultures, we need to do quite big things like dismantle hierarchies within organisations, democratise organisations, share power. Those kind of things have been proven to work to drive more inclusivity within organisations. They don't tend to get done, partly because they're really difficult to do, and partly because they're not that attractive, arguably, to people who are already at the top of these organisations. Because that means not just sort of sharing out a bit more power, if you like, but actually giving something up. And that means that we do tend to get this more incremental change. And that sounds like a really pessimistic way of looking at it, but my argument would be that we at least need to acknowledge some of those contradictions and tensions that are involved in order to move forward more productively.
You know, in answer to your question, how do we get people from more diverse backgrounds? Having this discussion is a starting point. You know, obviously, Louise, you bring an amazing perspective that, to be honest, does not really get discussed that much within businesses, because it is challenging us to think of it from a completely different lens, and that is uncomfortable. But the more we normalize the discussion, the more we can actually have the discussion, and we can then have the debate that goes with it. We can start addressing the processes. I must say, I found it very interesting what you were saying there about the processes come first and the culture then follows. Am I right? That's how you were looking at it.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's complicated, but it goes back to that idea of unconscious bias, which is a very behavioral, it's a very strongly focused on behaviors. And I think by now we know that unconscious bias training doesn't really have a very significant effect on organizational change. And it kind of almost entirely misses the point. It's a very individualized and psychologized approach to a structural and systemic problem. So it almost can't work. Now, depending how cynical or critical you are, depending what word you want to use, you could almost say that is the point. If you want to introduce quite cosmetic things that have the illusion of change but don't drive change, unconscious bias training is a very good one to do. But it's also very difficult, we know, to de-bias individuals. Therefore, you need that structural approach. So yes, it is really important to focus on structures and systems, because that's fundamentally where the problem is, particularly around social class.
Yeah. So I think making sure that we have that firms have entry-level programs that address this as a beginning is absolutely critical. And of course, we know that entry isn't everything, but if we don't address it at entry point, we're going to struggle to address this further up as people progress their careers, and we're not going to get the intended change across the businesses that we'd like to see. And there isn't a magic wand to be able to do it. It is taking little steps, but actually addressing them in as a fulsome way as we can. So having the entry-level programs, and really, and I do challenge everybody who's listening to this, is a starting point to say, when you look at your graduate programs, the school leaver programs, and obviously depending on the size of business, you can have many different programs, but ask yourself not just who came through and we're not getting enough applications from this demographic or that demographic, but who are the applications that didn't make it and why? And do you actually go and have a look at that? Because it is very interesting when you start looking at the applications on the cutting room floor and you go, why did this person make it and not that person? And then you start looking at the polish that tends to come through, that people ask for people who have credibility, and that's why they employed this person over that person. And then, Stephanie, you touched on many of this, so I won't go into detail on this, but, when we're looking at the skills that you need to be able to do a job, the more skills you add on, is that really necessary for the job? Why are you adding that? And is the temptation when you get the applications of people who are massively overqualified for the role, but yet you still tend to employ them? Why are you doing that? So these are all things that you have to address at entry point. But of course, the progression piece is critical. And there is a lot that needs to be done within this sector to look at where the blockages are. Now, of course, we lack data. That's a massive issue. But when we look at where the blockages are, for different groups. And I'm very hesitant to, I say say that in an overarching high level way when we look at different groups, because people don't neatly fit into different boxes, but we can see that there are ceilings, for example, where women tend to go and where ethnic minorities tend to be. And when we're looking at socioeconomic diversity, it will help when we have that data and that firms start collecting that data. So if the blockage comes post-program, which I think for many people it does, when I say post-program, postgraduate program, apprenticeship program, school leaver program, and it happens actually quite early on in people's career, for all the reasons that Louise addressed about why people promote, and it isn't always logical, the real why isn't always logical. And then when you start to see the pattern, that allows you then to be able to address why are we not seeing promotion from these groups? What is missing? And that is when you then start to be able to have a much more careful conversation with the hiring managers who probably are being unintentional and not even realizing that they are doing it. And that's when you can put in place the support, the development, the skills, and I say future skills development. We have a lot of conversations about what those are, and are we equipping the young people early on in their careers with the necessary development so that they can then catapult their career. And just one final point I'd like to make is not just focusing on the technical side, but it is looking at what we love to call the soft skills side, because often it can be a very political environment. There can be a lot of cultural norms that people have within an industry that we like to perpetuate. And if people don't relate to those cultural norms, it becomes very, very difficult to play in that game when you don't know what the rules are. And so these are all things that need to be addressed and spoken about, because it's only when you do that can we stop doing some of those behaviors, and can we assist people who some of these behaviors are alien to.
I'm just going to make one brief kind of a very, very practical example to kind of tie some of the things that Karis and Louise have been saying together. So we talked about there needs to be structural change in order to really drive kind of this diversity goal. One of the things that we have lots of conversations with respect to our employers is their process for first year programs. So these are like the spring weeks, the insight weeks that employers have to kind of give an introduction to their industry or their organization. Most of the deadlines for those programs happen early on in the first term at university. And if you're a student from a lower socioeconomic background that maybe didn't go to a top performing school, you probably have not had a lot of career support prior to university. So they are going to miss out on that opportunity to have exposure to a spring week, because in their first couple months, first couple weeks of being at university, they're probably just trying to settle in. They're not thinking about their careers yet. So one of the things that we really emphasize with our partners is to delay those deadlines for spring weeks so that the students have the opportunity to kind of get bedded in and start thinking about careers, or to ring fence opportunities for students from a lower socioeconomic background and have those application processes in the spring. But I can definitely hear some of the conversations that we've had, Louise, when you're talking about this fight for top talent. Whenever we bring up the idea of postponing deadlines or ring fencing, it's, well, we have more than enough applicants. Why would we delay the deadlines? Well, you're not going to be getting, kind of the diverse background that you're looking for. So that's just one very simple example that kind of ties all of those points together. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. And then I can just see we've got a question that's come in that relates to this. So when we're talking about the challenges of progression, how do companies keep track of which staff are from a socioeconomic background and lower socioeconomic background? And is this more difficult than other characteristics to pin down and keep track of? So I guess it's a sort of, how are we monitoring this? What does success look like in terms of progression? What are we doing, and what more could be done in this area? It's quite a broad topic, but I'm interested to get your views there.
Oh, Karis, you go.
No, go ahead, Louise.
I was just going to talk very briefly about how we measure social class, and then perhaps you can talk about maybe the practicalities or not. But on the measurement, this is a really brilliant question. Measuring social class is really tricky. It's what we call a very slippery category. It's dynamic. We can change our social class, and there's many different ways depending on whether you're an economist or a sociologist in terms of how you could measure social class. Very briefly, the measure that most people, or what we've kind of settled on in this area generally for organizations as the measure to use, is parental occupation. So a socioeconomic classification of background. And I think it's the Cabinet Office that recommend that organizations looking to monitor this should measure parental occupation at the age of 14. So that's what people should be asked about if you're asking your staff about their demographics and about their social class. And although there is no single measure that is perfect or tells us everything about someone's background, this is probably the least bad or the most good, if you like. And because we know, apart from anything else, that parental occupation at age 14 is a very strong predictor of life chances further down the line. So again, there are other measures that can be used, but the one that we've kind of tried to settle on is parental occupation at age 14. And that's what many of the kind of most forward-looking organizations are now recording for all their staff where they can do so.
The challenge with it is collecting the data, and collecting the data is about trust that you build with your staff. And I know that obviously when it comes to gender, that data is collected when people join, but when it comes, for example, to ethnicity, that data isn't collected, and there's been a huge drive by the industry to collect that data. And I think there've been certainly what we've got from our member firms at the Investment Association is that many firms are collecting their data and making good inroads. And of course, it varies from one firm to the other. But when it comes to socioeconomic, there have been, firms are not as well developed when it comes to being able to collect that data. So it's, as Louise said, the data that you need to collect, and then it is asking your employees to please give you that data and explaining why you are looking at that data and why you want it. And it all comes down to trust. But only once you have it can you then track, because then you're able to see, in the same way when we look at gender, do women plateau at a certain point? You will be able to see that when it comes to socioeconomic background.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have started to see an increase in the number of partners that do not only collect the data, but do full reporting on the data, as you're talking about, Karis, because that's really important, both from a progression into the graduate job, but also progression within and the inclusion element. I think that also we made a reference to making sure that it's being discussed, and it's something that the people are willing to talk about, collecting that data and then reporting on it, and then creating certain actions to improve on that is critical. Data is great. It doesn't necessarily drive the change. It informs the change that maybe needs to happen and the actions that need to come out of that.
And Stephanie, I wonder if we've got people watching this who are sort of saying, right, I want to do really well. I'm running a team. I've got that entry point data. Then what? What are the sort of milestones that people can look for as their points where they say, right, across my team, I could assess at this point and collect this bit of data, so that they continue to collect the data as time goes on?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Karis was talking about, collecting it on application is probably the best entry point, because obviously everybody goes through that, but completely agree. There is an element of trust that you have to have, because it's always an opt-out option. But the partners that we have done like a big push to do that collection of data kind of early on in individuals' careers, and then doing a catch up, as Kara said, because it hasn't been questions that are on kind of application processes or entry processes at that point. I think if you're sitting there as a manager or a leader, some of the things to think about is how do you create that environment of inclusion so that people are willing to talk about it. Lots of organizations have networks, like formal network groups for different backgrounds, different characteristics, to hopefully drive cultural change. But without having allies from top of the organization who are actually participating in those networks, then it becomes just a little bit of a self-sounding board, and it doesn't really help with cultural change outside of the people who are actually participating. So I think one of the really important items is, if you're a leader in an organization, find one of those networks that maybe you don't fit that background, but become an ally of that background and participate in those events, and really try to drive that change. The other thing that we hear from our alumni, and Karis made a reference to this, is those unwritten rules. And I think that is the big challenge with people progressing once they're in the graduate job, is they don't really know what those unwritten rules are, because they don't have those informal networks. So establishing, buddy systems or frequently asked question kind of handbooks for when people join, and really just creating an environment where people feel like they can ask questions, even if they're really basic questions, without being ridiculed, to be quite frank, because some of the stories that we've heard from our alumni is they do ask questions in order to build those networks, and actually are ridiculed for it in the end because they don't already know the answer. So I think it's that environment of inclusion, just from an ally programs, or also from the environment of being able to ask any kind of question that you might have.
And then so we've got a question in here that's sort of saying, okay, so you've encouraged people from the lower socioeconomic backgrounds to go into an industry, but then when they enter the industry, is there any difference between the training program that someone from that background would have versus somebody that comes from a more affluent background?
That's such a good question, and I'm not sure I know the right answer to it. But for me, if I look at this as an managing entry programs, the first thing is don't make any assumptions. Don't make any assumptions that anybody has experience of the world of work. And what you see has been completely normal. And of course, we all started our careers knowing all of this. We just forget how we developed and how we morphed. But having programs, and you can make them slightly deeper depending on what your candidate cohort, where your candidate cohort is from, of where you are, such as a campus to corpus, if we had investment 2020, but there are different ways of calling it. But where you're starting to address everything we spoke about the cultural and social norms within an office environment, and don't assume that people are going to know, for example, some of the things that irritate line managers is appearing at a meeting without having a pen and paper. And of course you have a pen and paper, but you don't know that unless you've had experience of working in the office. So it is almost preempting what are these things that you just assume people are going to be able to do and know about, and being able to teach people, this is what is expected of you, and this is why. We'd like you to summarize your actions at the end. We'd like you to follow up where you are with what you've done at the end of the day. And because these are the common complaints that we hear from hiring managers who are not necessarily ready for the new starter, yet they are by no means a barometer of their future potential. So you could have an amazing recruit there, but who's just got a few stumbling blocks in terms of being familiar with what is expected of office etiquette. And we hear things like chewing gum, for example. I mean, there's one that really gets people very upset. If you don't like chewing gum, tell people in our office we don't have gum for the following reasons. It sticks to furniture, whatever have you. But don't get upset if people do that. So I think that those are really, really important things to start with. And then I would say, and this is very much applicable to everybody, regardless of what background you are from, and that is about thinking about what do people think of you when you leave the room? And this is about your brand. So what's the Karis brand when I finish, and what did you think of me? And that is about, and I need to then think about, how do I want to come across? How do I want people to see me? And that is about your personal brand. That's really, really important. And there is a bit of a kind of age divide here, I have to say. We hear comments about, I speak about my kids always on their phone, walking around the house with it. And it's like, that is insane. Why do you do that? And so thinking about, preparing people, if there is a certain way in which you have an expectation which you should challenge in itself, because we can learn from younger people. Just remember, we're dealing with different demographics here in terms of age, in terms of backgrounds, and we can learn from each other.
And I don't know if Stephanie, if you've got any points to add there.
Yeah, I don't think there's much to add, just kind of expanding it with a specific example from what I was saying earlier about those kind of internal networks. If there is a social mobility network, maybe creating an environment where it's not additional training, but it is just that atmosphere of a buddy system to be able to ask those questions. I know that there are some organizations that have started doing like a skills-based assessment when someone joins, to identify what training might be beneficial to them. Obviously, that could apply to anybody, not just individuals from lower socioeconomic background. I think I hesitate to say there's additional training that's required, because once again, they obviously received the offer for that job, that graduate job. And so we don't want to be in a situation where we're making them stand out even more as someone that's lacking. It's really, as a manager, trying to look at their life experience and what does that contribute, what value does that bring to the firm, and including them in those conversations and discussions, meetings, problem solving, whatever it might be, for the value that they bring, rather than looking for the deficiencies that are there.
Trying to make them too polished.
Yeah.
We'll accept you in and then we'll polish you up a bit. No, that's definitely not what we want. And a question actually that's probably more on the theory side of this, so probably one for you, Louise. Should socioeconomic class be something that is a protected characteristic, do you think?
Yes, I do think it should be. This is one of those quite kind of controversial issues, and clearly not everyone's going to agree on this. But I think that making something a protected characteristic isn't a panacea. It doesn't solve every problem. We've seen that with other protected characteristics, but it does drive some really important change. And I think that if we think about kind of other protected characteristics, say sex, for example, it would be kind of unthinkable now to think that that would be not protected within law. And at the moment, we don't think that about social class, but I think we probably should, because it is probably one of the defining features of what determines our path through life. That it's therefore very important that it is protected. There are many reasons why it hasn't been to date, one of which goes back to those questions of measurement, what we define as social class. But those questions probably are semantical. So I do think that it should be protected in law. But I would also say that I don't think there's much chance of that in the near future, unfortunately. But we can keep pushing for it.
And I assume that it's the same sort of shared opinion there, that the other two agree.
It's really tricky. I mean, how do you apply it? I think huge questions about that. And I also think that understanding isn't quite there. Certainly when I look at our industry, and it's raising awareness of the understanding, collecting the data, I think we have a very different conversation where we have that in place.
And I'm just conscious of time, so we've got a couple of minutes left. So I'm just going to quickly revert to one of the questions here. So initially, Louise, when you talked about middle-class males and the sort of status they have, does the same apply for the medical profession, do you think?
Yes, this is a really interesting question, and I like it because I'm writing a paper on this very subject right now. So
have you asked somebody to send this question in?
Yes, exactly. I've planted it. I might even just still be working out the answer, but no, it does. I mean, so if you look at prestige hierarchies within medicine, normally you would find surgery at the top and general practice at the bottom. And it is almost certainly no coincidence that surgery is dominated by men, historically white men, though not always anymore. And general practice is increasingly dominated by women. And there is a sense, a belief that as general practice has become more and more dominated by women, it has lost status. Not so much pay, that's complicated in the NHS because it's negotiated with the government, it's not a pure market, so it's a little bit complicated there. But in essence, the answer to that question is absolutely yes. But like everything in academia and elsewhere, this is contested and we argue about it a lot. So there is a question of cause and effect. So is it, for example, that people with so-called lower status identities have come into those occupations and then they've lost status, or do they lose status and therefore they become more open to people with lower status social identities? So there's that. One other thing, there's no simple binary between, say, men in prestigious positions and women in not. It depends on intersecting identities, and it also depends a little bit on the nature of the work. So the more technical the work, the more objectively performance can be measured, probably the less important social identities are in determining its status. The more subjective the work, the more ambiguous the knowledge is, the more difficult it is to measure performance, the more important social identities become in shoring up its status. So it's complicated, but in short, yes.
And wait for the paper to come out and
Yeah,
we'll find out all of this.
Several years down the line. But yeah.
No pressure. And then I guess a question for all of you really. Are there any industries that you've seen that you think are doing this really well, or any initiatives that you think that's something that we should be doing more of?
While Stephanie and Karis are thinking, shall I just come in very quickly on this? One thing I would say about this is that all industries and organisations, but particularly industries, are starting in very different places in this area, and therefore there's a lot to be learnt from each other, and there's a lot of kind of best practice sharing that can be done. But it's also really important to be aware that every organisation, every occupation needs to look at what's happening within that sector or whatever it is, in order to put together the kind of set of actions that are most relevant to them. And that probably goes back to kind of making sure we have the demographic data, that we use that to understand career progression as well as access, look at how intersections work with social class in determining progress through careers. So sort of good to have a kind of universal overview of this, but also recognizing that because organizations and occupations start in such different places, it's really important to be quite tailored in your approach. And I would just also add, there's loads of guidance out there now from different organizations in terms of how to do this. So things like the Social Mobility Index, the Social Mobility Commission has got all sorts of resources. So there's lots of places to look for help with this, I think.
You know, no one industry stands out to me, if I can be honest. I do think when I look back, we've come a long way, a really long way in a short period of time, but equally we have a very long way to go ahead of us. So focus on the ground gained and keep the momentum and propel it.
And then, oh, sorry, Stephanie, did I just interrupt you? No, so your mouth moved and thought I'd interrupted. So I guess it would be good to end on, if there's, so earlier on, Karis, you said one thing is for people to not make assumptions. And that stood out to me as a really key bit of advice for people that want to do good, whether it's individually, whether it's within their business, whether it's something they can teach to other people. And I thought that's a really good bit of advice, to just not make assumptions that people know anything, because then everyone starts from the same position and everybody has the same information. Even if they know it already, they're not led to believe that they are superior for knowing it, because in 2 minutes, everybody else in the room will know it as well. So I liked that bit of advice. I wonder if each of you have one thing that I realized, Karis, I've just stolen yours and given it away as if it was my own. So now you need to think of another one. But if there's one bit of advice that you could give to people that have dialed in today that want to do something to improve the situation, to continue to progress it, or to go away and teach themselves, is there one thing that you would advise people to do?
I would open above that one is broaden cultural norms, broaden our perception of what are cultural norms, because when we have a very narrowly defined set of cultural norms, we will by our nature exclude. Whereas if we broaden it, we stop having the conversation about whether the visible tattoo is a problem or not, because it becomes a cultural norm. We will then allow more people from many different backgrounds to feel that they are part in sharing in that culture.
Yeah, and I'll go back and build on my comment about inclusive, networks and participating as an ally. But that also extends to being creative about kind of the informal networking that takes place. Don't always have drinks at the bar. Don't always do something after work. Just be very creative about how you kind of broaden that horizon of being able to interact with individuals that you don't normally interact with, because the traditions of going for a drink after work is really going to eliminate your ability to interact with a wide range of individuals. So really be creative on that inclusive networking element.
I know we're just on time. Shall I come in very quickly? I'm going to go big because I'm a sociologist and I like to do that. I think we have to see organisations in their wider context. They're not isolated from wider society. They are society and they contribute to society. So the one thing I would say is that I think if we are interested in social mobility, if we think it matters, we need to also stay focused on inequality, because as I started with, we don't really have one without getting rid of the other. So we do need to look at those as kind of twin challenges, twin opportunities, if you like.
Great, and well done for starting and ending on the same point to sort of bookend it. I like that. So that is all we've got time for. We're right on time there. I found it really interesting. So thank you so much for all of you that have joined online and for the 3 panelists today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.